In the sterile fluorescence of the bank's interior, Ashley's voice cut through the hum of routine transactions, sharp and edged with impatience. Ma'am, you're not part of this transaction. Please step back to your place in line. Her words were directed at Grace, but it was John who felt the sting, as if the dismissal was meant for him too. He stood rooted to the spot, his broad frame a quiet bulwark beside the elderly woman. His jaw tightened, but his voice, when it came, was softer than before, laced with a restrained intensity that hinted at the storm of conviction brewing beneath his calm exterior. Ma'am, he said, addressing Ashley with a deliberate politeness that felt like a challenge, this woman is asking for what's rightfully hers. She deserves your full attention, not a glance at a computer screen while you brush her off. His words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of someone who had seen too much injustice to stay silent. Ashley's lips pressed into a thin, hard line, her irritation palpable. Her fingers, manicured and restless, tapped a staccato rhythm on the edge of her desk, betraying the internal debate raging within her. Should she push back, escalate this to her manager, or let it go? Her eyes darted to the line of customers behind John and Grace, their impatience simmering like a low-grade fever. She chose retreat, her voice clipped and professional. If she has further questions, she can schedule an appointment. This isn't something we can resolve right now. The words were a wall meant to shut down the conversation and restore order to her carefully controlled domain. From the back of the line, a voice muttered, dripping with exasperation, "For crying out loud, it's just a few dollars. She's wasting everyone's time." The comment was meant to be quiet, but it landed like a stone in a still pond, rippling through the room. John's head turned, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. No one met his gaze. Not truly. A few offered fleeting glances, their faces half hidden behind phone screens, or fixed on the scoffed linoleum floor, as if the weight of his stare was too much to bear. That old, familiar feeling crept up his spine, a ghost from his days in the Army, 3rd Infantry, Afghanistan. It was the same unease he'd felt when he'd seen things go wrong, when systems failed, when people looked the other way because it was easier than standing up. This wasn't about the fee Grace was disputing, some trivial sum the bank refused to refund. It was about something deeper, something uglier, the way people normalized disrespect, shrugging it off as long as it wasn't aimed at them. The apathy in the room pressed against John's chest, heavy and suffocating. A large man in a navy blazer, clearly bank security, emerged from near the glass doors, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. His radio crackled softly at his hip, a faint reminder of the authority he carried. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm, the kind of tone that demanded compliance without raising its pitch. "Is there a problem here?" His eyes locked onto John, assessing him, sizing up the situation. John's response was calm, almost serene, but unshakable. "No problem," he said, meeting the guard's gaze without flinching. "I'm just standing with her until someone listens to what she's owed." Beside him, Grace shifted, her slight frame dwarfed by his taller, sturdier one. She looked up at him, her eyes soft but steady, carrying a depth of emotion that seemed to hold a lifetime of quiet struggles. Her lips trembled, not from fear, John realized, but from the overwhelming weight of being seen, truly seen, after years of being overlooked. Her small, weathered hands clutched the paperwork she'd brought, the edges creased from her nervous grip. In that moment, John could sense the history behind her eyes, the decades of resilience that had carried her through loss and bureaucracy. "You don't have to do this, son," Grace said, her voice gentle but threaded with a quiet strength. The words were a whisper of gratitude but also a plea, as if she feared dragging him into her battle. Her eyes, lined with age, held a flicker of something else. Pride, perhaps, or the faint hope that this time someone might actually care. John's smile was small but warm, a flicker of reassurance. "Yes, ma'am, I do." His tone was resolute, the kind of conviction that came from a man who had made promises in the past and kept them. No matter the palampu, Grace extended a hand, her knuckles thin and marked with age spots, each one a testament to the years she'd endured. "Grace Turner," she said, her voice steady now. "Navy widow, my herald served 28 years, passed in 2008. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a life shared, a love lost, and a fight she was still waging in his name. John took her hand, his grip firm but respectful, the kind of handshake that spoke of camaraderie forged in shared sacrifice. "John Miller, Army, 3rd Infantry, Afghanistan," he replied, his voice low but clear. There was a quiet pride in the way he said it, not boastful but grounded, as if his service was a part of him he carried without needing to flaunt. Grace's faint smile grew, a knowing glint in her eyes. "Well, I'll bet Harold trained some of your commanding officers. He was tough but fair." Her voice softened, a trace of nostalgia coloring her words as she thought of her late husband, his discipline, his fairness, the way he'd shaped young soldiers into something stronger. "I like him already," John said, his tone light but genuine, a spark of humor breaking through the tension. For a moment it was just the two of them, two souls connected by the unspoken bond of service, standing together in a world that seemed to have forgotten what that meant. Behind the desk, Ashley cleared her throat, her fingers hovering above the keyboard, frozen in mid-motion. The sound was sharp, a reminder of her presence, her authority challenged. The security guard took a step closer, his posture stiffening. "Sir," he said, his voice still low but with an edge now, "I need to ask you to return to your place in line, or I'll have to escort you out." The threat hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. John didn't waver. "I'm not disrupting anything," he said, his voice still calm, still soft, but carrying the weight of a man who had faced worse than a security guard's ultimatum. "I'm simply standing beside a widow who's being ignored, and I'll stay here until someone actually looks at her paperwork." His words were measured, deliberate, like a command issued with absolute clarity. They weren't loud, but they filled the room, silencing the murmurs, the tapping of impatient feet, the rustle of papers. The air in the bank grew thick, charged with the weight of uncertainty. The other teller, Jennifer, stood frozen, her fingers twitching above her keyboard, as if unsure whether to continue her work or intervene. Her eyes flicked between John and Grace, the unyielding veteran and the quiet widow, and in that moment, she seemed to realize the ground beneath her wasn't as solid as she'd thought. Her breath caught, her professionalism wavering under the intensity of the scene unfolding before her. I'll get the manager," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Without waiting for approval, she slipped through a side door, her footsteps quick and uneven. John said nothing more. He didn't need to. His presence was enough, his arms loose at his sides, his stance unthreatening but immovable. The kind of posture that said he'd faced worse than this and come out the other side. He stood beside Grace, a silent pillar of support, his eyes fixed on the desk where Ashley still sat, her composure fraying at the edges. Grace, for her part, stood taller now, her chin lifted slightly, her shoulders squared despite the weight of years pressing down on her. But John could see the weariness in her eyes, the kind that came not from this moment, but from a lifetime of small battles. Paperwork denied, promises broken, dignity chipped away bit by bit. It wasn't just about today's fee, he knew. It was about all the days before, the countless times she'd been dismissed, her voice unheard, her worth unseen. Yet here she stood, resolute, her trembling hands clutching her paperwork like a shield, her quiet strength a testament to the life she'd lived and the love she'd lost. The room remained still, the tension palpable, as they waited for the manager to emerge. John's heart beat steady, his resolve unshaken. He wasn't just standing for Grace. He was standing for something bigger, something he'd sworn to protect long ago. Justice, fairness, the simple act of doing what was right, even when no one else would. For years, Grace Turner had endured the sting of dismissal, her pleas met with curt refusals and patronizing suggestions to wait her turn. Each rejection chipped away at her spirit, leaving her to question her worth in a world that seemed to overlook her existence. She was a woman in her late 70s, her silver hair neatly pinned, her posture still carrying the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered life's storms. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, a quiet ache lingered, a sense of being invisible, unimportant, her sacrifices forgotten. That morning, as she stood in the sterile fluorescence of the bank, her heart heavy with frustration, she clutched a worn leather card holder, a tangible link to a past that once commanded respect. Beside her stood John, a younger man whose broad shoulders and steady gaze hinted at a protective instinct. He was not related to Grace, but a bond of loyalty had formed between them, forged through shared moments of standing up against injustice. His presence was a quiet reassurance, a bulwark against the indifference she faced. John's eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the bank's lobby, taking in the muttering crowd and the impatient shuffle of customers waiting in line. His frustration simmered, not just for the $20 fee unjustly tacked onto Grace's account, but for the years of bureaucracy that had eroded her dignity. A man emerged from the back office, his gray suit crisp, his tie meticulously adjusted. Thomas Randall, in his mid-40s, carried himself with the practiced confidence of someone who believed his title insulated him from accountability. His clean-shaven face and slight swagger betrayed a sense of superiority, as if the world bent to his authority. He approached Grace with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a perfunctory gesture meant to placate rather than connect. "I'm Thomas Randall," he announced, his voice smooth but clipped. "I understand there's some confusion about your account." John stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with restrained anger. "There's no confusion," he said, his tone firm, unwavering. "She has documentation from the Navy Pension Office. That fee isn't supposed to be there." His words carried the weight of someone who had seen too many people like Grace dismissed, their voices drowned out by rules and regulations. Thomas's lips curled into a rehearsed chuckle, a sound that grated on Grace's nerves. "Sir," he said, his tone patronizing, "I appreciate your concern, but you're not a party to this account. Mrs. Turner can contact our regional office or schedule an appointment for next week." His words were a dismissal, a bureaucratic sidestep that left Grace feeling smaller, her trembling hands betraying the toll of age and frustration. John's expression didn't waver, but his voice dropped to a low, deliberate calm that carried more weight than any shout. "If you kick us out," he said, his eyes locked on Thomas, "I'll be on the news tonight. Bank throws out widow of Navy war hero over $20 fee. I'm sure your PR team would love that." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap, and the air in the bank shifted. Thomas's smile faltered, his confidence shaken as he realized the potential consequences of his indifference. Grace's hand moved slowly to her purse, her fingers trembling not from fear, but from the weight of years spent carrying her late husband's legacy. She pulled out a small leather card holder, its surface smoothed by decades of touch, a relic of a life that had once been honored. Opening it with care, she withdrew a folded card, its edges softened by time, and handed it to John. He unfolded it, and his breath caught. The Navy insignia stared back at him, alongside the name Commander Harold Turner, Medal of Honor recipient. The weight of those words hit John like a wave, his jaw tightening as he looked back at Grace. Her eyes, lined with age, held a quiet strength, but also a flicker of resignation. A woman accustomed to being overlooked. The bank's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, the crowd's murmurs fading into a distant hum. To John, the world narrowed to the woman before him, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to the sterile indifference of the bank. Grace leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of her pain. "I'm used to being forgotten," she said, her words piercing John's heart. He swallowed hard, his resolve hardening. "Not today, ma'am," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Those words were a vow, a promise to fight for her in a way the world hadn't. The tension at the counter hung like a storm cloud, thick and heavy. John stood firm, his hand clenched at his side, the knuckles whitening as he fought to keep his anger in check. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between her Grace and the growing crowd of onlookers. Customers glanced up from their phones, sensing the drama unfolding, torn between curiosity and the instinct to avoid involvement. The manager's mind raced, weighing the risk of bad publicity against the rigid policies he clung to like a lifeline. Then, without warning, the glass doors of the bank swung open, a rush of cool air sweeping through the lobby. Every head turned as the sharp, deliberate sound of boots on tile echoed through the space. A tall figure stepped into the light, his presence commanding the room without effort. He wore a U.S. Army dress uniform, the deep navy blue adorned with gold trim that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Rows of medals adorned his chest, each one a testament to a life of service, and 4 silver stars gleamed on each shoulder. General Harlan Briggs moved with a quiet authority, his steps purposeful, his demeanor free of arrogance. Behind him, two officers in similar formal attire followed, their faces stern, their posture impeccable. The bank fell silent, the weight of the general's presence stifling any lingering murmurs. The security guard instinctively stepped aside, his usual bravado replaced by deference. Even Thomas's composure cracked, his jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain his authority in the face of such an imposing figure. General Briggs didn't pause to survey the room. His gaze was fixed on the counter where Grace and John stood. He stopped just short of them, his presence a quiet force that shifted the room's dynamic. "Mrs. Turner," he said, his voice deep and steady, resonating with a warmth that contrasted with the cold formality of the bank. "We've been looking for you." Grace blinked, her heart skipping as a flicker of recognition crossed her face. Her eyes softened, a mix of surprise and relief washing over her. General Briggs offered a nod, his expression kind but resolute. "It's good to see you, Grace," he said, his words carrying a familiarity that hinted at a shared history. John stood a little straighter, an instinctive response to the general's presence. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension from moments before now overshadowed by the weight of this new arrival. Grace's heart swelled with a mix of pride and sorrow, her thoughts drifting to the man whose legacy she carried, and the unexpected ally who had walked through the door to remind the world of her worth. John Miller stood in the sterile glow of the bank lobby, the weight of his military past a quiet undercurrent in his chest. General Briggs, a man whose presence commanded respect, turned to him. "Military training never leaves you, does it?" he said, his voice carrying the gravitas of countless battlefields. "You're John Miller, formerly of the 3rd Infantry." He extended a hand, his grip firm and steady. "Specialist Miller, thank you for standing with her today." John's heart stirred at the mention of his old rank, a title that felt like an echo from a distant life. The 3rd Infantry had shaped him. Grueling marches, shared laughter in the barracks, the unspoken bond of soldiers. Shaking Briggs's hand, he murmured, "Just doing what's right, sir," though pride flickered within him, warm and unexpected. Briggs turned, his posture shifting as if addressing a regiment. The bank lobby, a mix of tellers, customers clutching forms, and a nervous manager, fell silent, drawn into the orbit of his authority. "Most of you don't know Grace Turner," he said, his deep voice filling the space. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, each face caught in the weight of his gaze. "Let me tell you who she is." He gestured to Grace, a slight woman by the counter, her hands clasped around a worn folder. Her gray hair was neatly pinned, her coat frayed at the edges, but her quiet dignity shone through. John remembered her earlier, patiently explaining her case to a teller who barely looked up. Now Grace's eyes glistened, though she held her composure, a testament to her resilience. "Grace is the widow of Navy Commander Harold Turner," Briggs said, "a Medal of Honor recipient who died saving 3 of his men overseas." Whispers rippled through the crowd, a mix of awe and reverence. John imagined Harold's final act. Intact, fearless, sacrificial, the kind of courage that lingered in memory. "But Grace isn't just the wife of a hero," Briggs added, his voice softening. "She's a hero herself." For over 30 years, Grace had devoted herself to military families. She built support programs for Navy spouses, offering solace during the endless nights of deployment. John pictured her comforting young wives, their voices trembling with worry, Grace's steady presence a lifeline. She organized relief during base evacuations, ensuring no one was forgotten. And she mentored over 500 young couples, guiding them through the challenges of military life with a warmth that made them feel seen. The crowd's murmurs grew, a blend of admiration and guilt. John glanced at the customers who had ignored Grace earlier, their eyes now fixed on her, their phones forgotten. He felt a spark of frustration, tempered by understanding. How easy it was to miss someone's quiet struggle. After Harold's death, Briggs continued, Grace could have stepped away. No one would have judged her, but she didn't. She volunteered over 14,000 hours at VA hospitals, comforting veterans, navigating their care. John envisioned her in those dim corridors, offering a kind word to a soldier haunted by war. "Most of you never saw her," Briggs said, his tone sharpening, "because she wasn't seeking recognition. She was serving." The silence deepened, heavy with reflection. Briggs lifted Grace's tattered pension statement, holding it aloft. This account is protected under Section 9B of the Military Survivor Pension Act. The fee charged, twice, is not only unfair, it's illegal. A gasp rose and the manager paled, stammering, "General, if there's been a mistake." "This isn't about mistakes," Briggs interrupted, his voice like steel. "It's about the culture here." He eyed the tellers, the customers, the manager. A widow with proper documents is dismissed by 2 employees and ignored by a room full of people too busy with their phones. John recalled his own moment of action, his voice shaking as he demanded the teller read Grace's papers, a reflex born of duty. "I'm ordering a full audit of this bank's veteran accounts," Briggs declared. "Every survivor benefit, pension, and VA exemption will be reviewed." He nodded to an officer who began noting names with calm precision. The manager's voice trembled. "Of course, General." Briggs turned to John, his gaze softening. "Specialist Miller, what you did today is what we try to teach. Honor, courage, loyalty. But standing up here without orders, that's leadership we can't always instill." John's face warmed, torn between pride and humility. "I just did what was right, sir," he said. "That's why I have a request," Briggs said, handing John a card bearing the Department of the Army's seal. "We're building a civilian liaison program to connect veterans and families with institutions. Too many fall through systems built for convenience, not care. Join us. You're the man we trust to represent us." John stared at the card, his heart a tangle of hope and hesitation. The military world called to him, but this was a new mission, one for Grace and countless others like her. The card sat heavy in John Miller's calloused hand, its crisp edges catching the light with bold black letters spelling out U.S. Army Veteran Community Affairs Liaison. His thumb brushed over the words, as if testing their reality. General Briggs stood before him, eyes steady with a quiet pride that made John's chest tighten. "I'm honored," John murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, rough with emotions he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, disbelief, maybe a flicker of awe he hadn't felt in years. Briggs's weathered face softened into a smile. "The honor's ours, son," he said, his tone carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too many battles to lie about what mattered. Behind them, the hum of Jefferson State Bank had stilled. The usual clamor of tapping keyboards, rustling papers, and impatient sighs from the line of customers had faded into a reverent hush. No one cracked jokes about the wait or grumbled about the heat outside. Every eye in the room was fixed on the 2 men, one a grizzled general, the other a plumber in a worn flannel shirt, locked in a moment that felt like a bridge between eras of sacrifice. John could feel their stares, not judgmental, but expectant, as if they too sensed something sacred unfolding. He didn't respond to Briggs right away. His fingers closed around the card, and he nodded, a gesture that held more promise than he realized at the time. For days, that card lived in the center console of John's battered pickup truck, nestled between a half-empty pack of spearmint gum and a rusty wrench. Every time he climbed into the driver's seat, its presence tugged at him, a silent question he wasn't ready to answer. Driving between plumbing jobs, the hum of the engine filling the calm, John's mind wandered to Grace Turner. Her voice echoed in his head, soft but piercing from that day at the bank when she leaned close and whispered, "I'm used to being forgotten." The words had landed like a punch, not because they were loud, but because they were true. Grace's face had held no bitterness, only a weary acceptance that made John's stomach twist. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror, in the eyes of buddies from his unit, in the veterans who drifted through life like ghosts nobody noticed. The more he thought about Grace, the more the card in his console felt like a lifeline. Plumbing was honest work, fixing leaks, unclogging drains, making things right in a tangible way. But it couldn't patch the deeper cracks, the ones that ran through the hearts of men and women like him, like Grace, like the countless others who'd served and come home to a world that didn't know what to do with them. Those cracks were invisible but jagged, carved by loss, isolation, and the slow erosion of purpose. John realized, somewhere between a late-night job and a sunrise coffee, that he couldn't ignore the card any longer. He pulled it out one evening, the truck parked in his driveway, and dialed the number before he could talk himself out of it. By the next month, John Miller was no longer just a plumber with a toolbox and a bad knee from his service days. He stood in a modest office near the VA hospital in Mobile, Alabama, wearing a pressed button-down shirt that felt foreign against his skin. A name badge pinned to his chest read, Veteran Community Affairs Liaison, U.S. Army. The office wasn't much, a small room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a bulletin board plastered with flyers for housing programs, mental health services, and VA benefits. The walls were plain, the carpet worn, but to John, it was a sanctuary. For the first time since his discharge, he felt like he was building something enduring, something that couldn't be washed away by a storm or eroded by time. Standing there, staring at the empty chairs, he felt a flicker of pride, tempered by the weight of responsibility. He wasn't sure he was ready, but he was willing. The job sounded straightforward. Help veterans navigate the labyrinth of government systems, benefits, healthcare, housing. But John quickly learned it was less about paperwork and more about presence. Most days it meant sitting across from someone and listening, really listening, to stories of struggle and survival. It meant deciphering VA acronyms for a bewildered retiree, chasing down answers for a young vet who'd given up hope, or filling out forms for a widow who couldn't face the bureaucracy alone. Some days the weight of those stories pressed on John's shoulders until he could barely breathe. Other days it felt like he was pouring concrete into the gaping holes left by years of neglect, steadying lives one conversation at a time. He wasn't fixing pipes anymore. He was helping people hold together the pieces of themselves. Grace Turner became a constant in his world. Every Thursday morning, without fail, she'd breeze into the office, her presence like a warm breeze cutting through the sterile air. She never knocked, just pushed the door open with a smile that lit up the room in a Tupperware container of oatmeal raisin cookies, her late husband Harold's favorite. John would clear his desk, and they'd sit together, the cookies between them, as Grace unraveled stories of her life with Harold. She spoke of base housing, of long deployments that stretched her heart across oceans, of the letters Harold sent from Vietnam. Her voice would soften as she described those letters, some faded, some smudged with tears, others ending with the simple plea, "Come home to me when this war is done." John listened, his coffee growing cold, as Grace painted a world of love and loss. He could see Harold in her words, a young soldier, brave but homesick, pouring his soul onto paper. And he could feel Grace's lingering grief, a quiet ache she carried with dignity. Those Thursdays became sacred to John. Grace's stories weren't just memories, they were a reminder of why he'd taken the job. She wasn't just a widow sharing cookies. She was a survivor, a woman who'd held her and family together through wars and decades, now fighting to keep Harold's memory alive. John found himself looking forward to her visits, not just for the cookies, but for the way she made him feel connected to something bigger. Her resilience stirred something in him, a determination to do more, to be more for the veterans who walked through his door. One day over a crumbling cookie, Grace suggested they start a gathering for other veterans. "Just a place to talk," she said, her eyes bright with purpose. "No forms, no officials, just us." John hesitated, unsure if he could pull it off, but Grace's quiet confidence was infectious. They started small, hosting bi-weekly meetings in the office. They called it The Circle, a name Grace chose because it felt like family, like coming home. Veterans from Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan gathered around fold-out tables, clutching styrofoam cups of coffee and Grace's cookies. At first, the room was quiet, heavy with unspoken pain. But slowly, haltingly, stories emerged. Tales of battles, of buddies lost, of the struggle to fit back into a world that had moved on without them. The circle wasn't therapy, wasn't official, but it was real. It was a space where burdens could be shared, where silence gave way to understanding. Word of the circle spread like ripples on a pond. Local churches got involved, dropping off casseroles and homemade pies. A retired nurse volunteered to help veterans sort out their medication schedules, her gentle patience a balm to frazzled nerves. A high school student, wide-eyed and earnest, began recording the veterans' stories for a history project. Those recordings later found a home in the Mobile Public Library, displayed alongside photos and handwritten letters. a testament to lives that refuse to be forgotten. What began with one widow and one quiet veteran at a bank counter grew into a movement, a quiet, courageous effort to heal wounds that couldn't be seen but could be felt. For John, the circle was more than a job. It was a lifeline. After years of drifting since his discharge, he felt something he'd thought was gone forever: purpose. Every story shared, every hand shaken, every tear wiped away in that cramped office reminded him why he kept going. He wasn't just a liaison, he was a brother in arms, a friend, a witness to lives that deserved to be remembered. The weight of his own service, once a burden, became a bridge to others. He lay awake some nights, thinking of the faces in the circle, wondering if he was doing enough, if he could ever fill the cracks he saw in their eyes. But each morning he rose, put on his badge, and walked into the office, ready to try. Exactly 1 year after Grace Turner first stepped into Jefferson State Bank, her folder of papers clutched tightly, her dignity unshakable, she passed away. It happened quietly in her sleep, as if she'd simply decided her work was done. There was no struggle, no fanfare, just the gentle closing of a life that had carried so much for so long. John learned of her passing through a phone call from her daughter, the news delivered in a voice thick with grief but laced with pride. It was how Grace would have wanted it: simple, direct, no fuss. John sat at his desk, staring at the empty chair where Grace used to sit, the Tupperware container of cookies still on his shelf. His throat burned, his eyes stung, but he didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, he thought of her smile, her stories, her unwavering belief that no one should be forgotten. And he knew the circle would go on, because Grace had shown him how to build something that lasted. The phone call came early, just as the first rays of dawn crept through John's curtains. It was Grace Turner's niece, her voice soft but heavy with grief. "She thought the world of you," she said, her words trembling with the weight of loss. "She'd light up talking about those Saturdays at your office, how you made her feel like she mattered again, like her life still had purpose." John sat on the edge of his bed, the words sinking into him like stones. Grace, with her sharp wit and unyielding spirit, was gone. His chest tightened as he pictured her, her gray hair neatly pinned, her eyes bright with stories of a life lived fiercely alongside her husband, Commander Harold Turner. She wasn't just a widow, not to anyone who truly knew her. She was a force, a quiet warrior who'd carried the weight of sacrifice with grace and grit. The funeral was held in a modest chapel on Mobile's west side, a place that felt both sacred and intimate. White pews gleamed under the glow of sunlight, streaming through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the wooden floor. At the front, a folded American flag rested beside a framed photograph of Grace and Harold, both smiling with a kind of understated joy that only comes from years of shared hardship and love. Grace wore her signature pearls in the photo, a touch of elegance that spoke to her strength, while Harold's uniform was crisp, a testament to his service. John stood in the back, his Army service dress feeling stiff after years in a closet. He hadn't worn it for protocol's sake. He wore it because Grace deserved that kind of honor. She'd earned it, not just as a military spouse, but as a woman who'd fought her own battles, uncelebrated but no less vital. When the time came for remarks, John approached the pulpit, his steps deliberate, his heart pounding with the weight of what he wanted to say. He carried no notes. He didn't need them. The words were etched in his memory, shaped by years of knowing Grace. "I met her in a bank," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. He could still see that day. Grace standing tall despite the way the tellers dismissed her, their voices dripping with condescension, as if her age and her status as a widow made her invisible. She was being ignored, talked over, treated like her time was done, but Grace Turner was never just someone's widow. His eyes swept the room, meeting the gazes of those who knew her, who understood. She was a leader, a builder, a protector of families. In my book, she was a soldier, just without the medals pinned to her chest. He paused, letting the silence carry the weight of his words. That day in the bank, something shifted. A whole room was reminded of who she really was, and in the years that followed, she reminded an entire town. As John stepped down, his throat tight, he caught sight of a retired Navy officer, his face weathered but resolute, rising to salute Grace's casket. The gesture was spontaneous, unspoken, yet it rippled through the chapel. One by one, veterans in the pews stood, their movements slow but deliberate, a silent tribute to a woman who'd stood beside a soldier and never stopped serving. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the mournful notes of a lone bugler playing taps. It wasn't for a fallen soldier in the traditional sense, but for Grace, whose life had been a testament to resilience, to the quiet courage of those who hold the home front together. Weeks later, something remarkable unfolded. Grace's story, the moment in the bank, the arrival of General Briggs, the founding of the community circle she'd inspired, caught the attention of a national columnist writing a Memorial Day feature. The piece struck a chord, spreading like wildfire across social media, picked up by news networks and shared by veterans groups nationwide. John read the article late one night, his coffee growing cold as he traced the words that captured Grace's essence. Her name, once confined to Mobile's small circles, now echoed across the country. By month's end, her legacy was immortalized at Arlington, her name etched not just beside heralds, but on a separate bronze plaque honoring the service of military families. At its base were the words John had spoken at her funeral. She was never just someone's widow, she was a soldier of a different kind. He imagined Grace's reaction, her quiet smile, maybe a wry comment about all the fuss. But deep down, he knew she'd be proud, not for herself, but for what it meant for others like her. At the heart of it all was a single, unassuming act. John Miller, a quiet veteran in a ball cap and jeans, hadn't set out to make history that day in the bank. He didn't know cameras would capture him standing beside Grace, his posture firm, his eyes defiant against the injustice he saw. He didn't know her name would one day resonate in military circles across the nation. He simply saw a wrong, Grace, dismissed and disrespected, and refused to let it stand. That moment, that quiet act of standing still when others turned away, sparked everything. John thought of John often, wondering what went through his mind as he stepped out of line. Was it anger, duty, or just the simple, unshakable belief that Grace deserved better? Whatever it was, it changed everything. Grace's life had been a testament to standing for others. In base housing, she'd been the one knocking on doors, checking on young spouses left alone during deployments. In hospital wings, she'd sat with families, her presence a steady anchor in their darkest hours. In rooms full of forgotten military spouses, she'd been their voice, their advocate, their reminder that they were seen. And in that fleeting moment at the bank, someone had finally stood for her. John felt a pang of regret that it had taken so long, but also a swell of gratitude for John Miller, whose quiet courage had given Grace the recognition she'd never sought, but always deserved. Their story, Grace's and John's, wasn't just about military service, though that was its backbone. It was about dignity, about seeing the person behind the paperwork, the human behind the title of widow or spouse. It was about remembering that the freedoms we hold dear are upheld not only by those who take up arms, but by those who wait, who sacrifice, who keep going long after the bugles fade. John thought of Grace's laugh, her stories, the way she'd made everyone around her feel stronger, and he realized her story wasn't just hers. It belonged to every military spouse, every family member who carries the weight of service in their own way. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't just about Grace Turner. It was about all of us in the quiet moments when we choose to stand. In a small, sleepy town where the hum of daily life often drowned out the quieter cries for help, an old man named John Miller shuffled into the local bank one crisp autumn morning. His worn coat hung loosely on his frail frame, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a tattered envelope stuffed with papers. John's heart thudded with a mix of hope and dread. For weeks, he'd been battling a faceless system, one that seemed to care little for his decades of loyalty as a customer. His savings, painstakingly set aside over a lifetime of modest labor, were now tangled in a bureaucratic mess, threatened by fees and penalties he didn't understand. The weight of it all pressed heavily on his chest, making each step toward the bank counter feel like a march through quicksand. He wasn't just fighting for his money, he was fighting for his dignity, for the right to be seen and heard in a world that seemed to have forgotten him. At the counter stood a young teller, her face a mask of practiced indifference. She barely glanced up as John approached, her fingers tapping impatiently on the keyboard. Her mind was already elsewhere, on the lunch break she'd taken an hour, on the weekend plans she'd been texting about. To her, John was just another task, another number in a long line of customers. When he tried to explain his situation, his voice soft and halting, she cut him off with a rehearsed spiel about policy, her tone clipped and in cold. John's heart sank. He felt invisible, as if his years of hard work, his quiet pride, meant nothing in the face of this young woman's disinterest. He wanted to shout, to demand respect, but his voice faltered, and he stood there defeated, his hands shaking even more as he gripped the counter for support. Behind John, a line of customers had formed, their impatience palpable. Some sighed loudly, checking their watches. Others stared at their phones, scrolling through feeds that numbed them to the world around them. The air grew thick with unspoken frustration, as if John's struggle was an inconvenience they couldn't be bothered to witness. They saw an old man holding up the line, not a human being fighting to hold on to his life's work. Their silence was deafening, a collective choice to look away, to stay uninvolved. Each person in that line carried their own burdens. Bills to pay, deadlines to meet, personal dramas swirling in their minds. But in that moment, their indifference became a wall, isolating John further in his quiet desperation. But one woman in the line refused to stay silent. Grace Thompson, a middle-aged school teacher with kind eyes and a heart that ached for the overlooked, watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of unease. Her chest tightened as she saw the teller's dismissive gestures, the way John's shoulders slumped with each curt response. Grace knew what it was like to feel small, to be brushed aside. She'd spent years teaching kids who'd been written off by others, kids who just needed someone to believe in them. Now, standing in that bank, she felt a fire ignite within her. She couldn't just stand there pretending not to see. Her hands clenched into fists, not out of anger but out of resolve. She thought of her own father, a man much like John, who'd once been humiliated by a landlord who wouldn't listen. Grace had been too young to help then, but she wasn't too young now. Stepping out of line, Grace approached the counter, her voice steady but firm. "Excuse me," she said, addressing the teller. "This man deserves your full attention. He's trying to explain something important, and you're not listening." The teller's eyes widened, caught off guard by the interruption. For a moment, she bristled. Her pride stung, but Grace's calm authority made her pause. Grace turned to John, her gaze warm and encouraging. "Please go ahead and tell her what's going on. I'm here with you." John's eyes, clouded with exhaustion, flickered with a spark of gratitude. He took a deep breath and began again, his voice steadier now, bolstered by the unexpected ally at his side. He spoke of the letters he'd received, the fees that didn't make sense, the savings he'd worked so hard to protect. This time the teller listened, not because she suddenly cared, but because Grace's presence demanded it. The other customers in line shifted uncomfortably. Some felt a pang of guilt, realizing they'd been complicit in their silence. Others felt irritated, wishing Grace would just let the line move. But Grace didn't waver. She stood there, her quiet strength a beacon in the sterile fluorescence of the bank. She wasn't loud or confrontational. Her power came from her refusal to walk away, from her insistence that John's voice mattered. Inside, her heart raced. She wasn't used to making a scene, and part of her worried what others might think. But a deeper part of her, the part that believed in fairness and kindness, knew this was right. She thought of her students, how she taught them to stand up for each other. Now she was living that lesson herself. As John finished explaining, the teller, now under scrutiny, promised to escalate his case to a manager. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a start, a crack in the wall of indifference that had threatened to crush him. John turned to Grace, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He felt seen for the first time in weeks, as if his existence had been validated by this stranger's kindness. Grace smiled, her own eyes misty. "You're welcome," she said softly. "We have to look out for each other." In that moment, a quiet bond formed between them, two strangers united by a simple act of humanity. The ripple of Grace's action didn't stop there. A young man in line, who'd been scrolling through his phone, looked up, his conscience stirred. He'd seen people ignored before, at stores, at bus stops, in his own workplace, but he'd always stayed quiet, telling himself it wasn't his place to intervene. Now, watching Grace, he felt a shift inside him. Maybe it was his place. Maybe it was everyone's. An older woman behind him, who'd been muttering about the delay, fell silent, her irritation giving way to reflection. She thought of her late husband, how he'd always been the one to speak up for others. She wondered if she'd lost that part of herself along the way. As John left the bank, his steps a little lighter, he carried more than just a promise from the teller. He carried the memory of Grace's kindness, a reminder that he wasn't as alone as he'd felt. Grace, too, walked away changed. She felt a quiet pride, not in herself, but in the power of small acts to make a difference. She thought about how easy it would have been to stay in line, to keep her head down, but she hadn't, and that choice filled her with hope. Hope that others might do the same, that the world wasn't as cold as it sometimes seemed. This story isn't just about John or Grace or a bank that forgot how to care. It's about all of us living in a world where it's so easy to look away. We rush through our days, distracted by screens and schedules, tuning out the pain of those around us. Patience wears thin, and kindness can feel like a luxury we can't afford. But Grace's choice shows us another way. Her quiet stand reminds us that dignity isn't won through grand gestures or loud protests. It's built in the small, steady moments when we choose to see someone, to listen, to care. John's courage, too, teaches us something profound. His wasn't the bravery of battle or heroics. It was the courage to keep standing, to keep speaking, even when the world seemed determined to ignore him. Think about your own life. Have you ever seen someone dismissed at a store, a hospital, a bus stop? Someone talked over, brushed aside, treated like they didn't matter? Did you speak up? Did you stand with them? Or did you, like so many in that bank line, stay quiet, too busy, or too unsure to act? Grace's lesson is clear. We don't need power or prestige to make a difference. We just need the will to pause, to see, to act. And John's story reminds us that courage can be as simple as refusing to give up, refusing to let the world's indifference win. This is a call to share your own stories. Have you ever stepped in for someone being mistreated? Or been the one overlooked, only to have a stranger stand by your side? These moments, big or small, are the threads that weave a kinder world. They're proof that decency and honor still exist, that one person's choice can spark change far beyond what they see. If this story touched you, pass it on. Share it with someone who still believes in the power of standing up, of standing together. You don't need a title or a uniform to do what's right. You just need a heart willing to act.